Hey everybody, it's Aequus. Today I have BJ Swain on my podcast in regards to his new book, Luminarium. So I have a couple of questions from Annalise and I. So how are you doing today, BJ?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. It's Saturday, so it's my day off. So I have a couple of questions, and I'm just going to go ahead and get started with the first one. So what inspired you to write Luminarium?
Well, I had a project I had sort of considered several years back, looking at some of the material in Barrett's Magus, looking at that in juxtaposition with several daily prayers and conjurations and planetary conjurations and prayers that I collected from various grimoire sources. And I was looking at something to put together during the quarantine. Wanted something that would be accessible for people to make it easy for them to get started with planetary and angelic magic and with conjuration. And I looked back at that old project. It had some very different directions that it was headed in than what I ended up with Luminarium, but something around that idea of looking at daily planetary prayers and looking at a system of conjuration for the planetary angels was what got me kind of started. And then from there, the idea of something that people could do quickly without having to have as much setup or as much of a background in magic got me looking at all of the stuff that it talks about with the different types of preparation and sort of using magical techniques in order to augment preparation time so that you can maybe have a shorter preparation time and still get into conjuring effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely surprised me how fast I was able to get it going because I'm usually a master at procrastinating. So I definitely was able to get through it and get it going in about 2 weeks. So it was awesome and very helpful. You covered this in some of the other podcasts that you were a guest on, but for those who don't know, where did you draw your inspiration to put like the pieces together to create the conjuration system?
Well, I looked at a few different sources, but most of what Luminarium uses is based on a conjuration that I had done previously in public working that was done at William Blake Lodge a few years ago. For that, I drew on the Hygromantia, the Greek magical papyri, and Heptameron primarily. The particular Hygromantia working, I started looking at that because we had a member whose son was interested in magic, and he was interested in the idea of doing the child scryer role in a conjuration. And so I looked in the Hygromantia for an example of that, because some of the Hygromantia approaches are a little bit more streamlined than some of the later approaches, and it had ones that specifically dealt with working in that context. And things shifted. We ended up using an adult scryer for it, but I still built this model where we worked on sort of augmenting the scryer's interaction through the means in the Hygromantia and the means in the PGM, and making kind of a more empowered scrying context for the conjuration. And so Luminarium took that basis and reworked it into something for an individual, but then also contextualized it in sort of magical framework based on calling upon certain powers of creation and powers that are used in linking magical forces to the affected material, and setting up a context in which that could work that would be a little bit more accessible for people.
Yeah, I think you did a great job.
Thank you.
So, one of the things that I think I took away was like the process of purification. Can you tell people why you think it's important to spend time purifying yourself before ritual?
Well, I think that you could jump in without going through a major purification process, but there's a lot of things in life where you need to be ready and in sort of the right place in order to do them. A lot of people who are friends with me on Facebook know that in addition to magic, I also coach fencing, and not just on sort of a recreational, historical, fun, weird activity way. I coach a competitive college team. And one of the things that I talk with athletes about frequently is their mindset and a certain mental readiness. And so when we talk about that, we talk about achieving a particular mental state during competition. And so you need to do things before competition to achieve that mental state. There's also elements of being physically prepared. So getting the right amount of rest the night before, eating the right foods the day before, avoiding getting hungover by partying the night before, things like that are things that are considerations that have to be taken into account. So it's not just with magic where we have to be prepared for the things that we're doing. Pretty much everything in life, we're going to be more successful if we prepare ourselves in the right way to be physically and mentally ready. So in magic, when we talk about purification, there are things which could hold us back from being successful. Some of that is our own perception of our readiness. Some of it is based on the idea that there are things that might make us ritually impure or ritually unclean, or make it so that we aren't ready to appear before spirits or appear before the divine. And some of that's going to have more to do with, again, our own perceptions and our own understandings. And it's not something in the sense of, well, if you believe it, that makes it so, as much as if you're stuck in a mindset where you think there are all of these impediments, you're going to impede yourself. You're going to make it so that you can't make that connection because you're going to be too distracted by all the reasons that you shouldn't be able to connect, all the reasons that you're potentially going to fail. So purifying yourself helps remove some of those distractions. There's also more real and material effects. You could have magic working against you. There could be things where someone is jealous of you and they don't necessarily do magic or don't intend to curse or impact you, but that jealousy and the evil impulse acting through them could create some force or some effect that impedes you. They could actively choose to create some force or effect that impedes you, or your own guilt or assessment of things that you've done could cause you to do things where you create some magical force that blocks things up or ties things up and impedes you. So the idea of uncrossing yourself, of opening roads, of making yourself clean and ritually pure can help remove those impediments that are either created by yourself or created by others. So that's where there's an importance to that. There's also an element of going through those processes of building ritual purity, building spiritual cleanliness. They can also build what I call charism, or build a spiritual fire, or sort of a power and authority, a place of a kind of dynamic, energized balance that allows you to interact with and perceive the spirit world more clearly, but also gives you a little bit more force in order to command and compel things in the spirit world. And so there's a few benefits and a few reasons why we need to be mindful of preparation, and those preparations need to be engaged in a way that is based on accentuating those benefits and making them as strong as we can, which is kind of the approach Luminarium takes. Instead of just saying, don't eat beans or meat or drink for 9 days, it gives you a bunch of options for ways in which you can increase that spiritual power. You can remove that miasma, which is distracting you. You can remove those magical influences that other people may have placed upon you. And so it gives you a more focused, more direct approach to creating that preparation.
Definitely took that away myself. Like, I guess, I don't know, I didn't realize how unprepared I felt before until I started purifying.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that was definitely really important for me to start doing. So, the next question I have for you is what purpose do the ancestors have in the ritual?
Well, the ancestors have kind of a multi part purpose. So, on the one hand, they create the spiritual context for the work. So in a lot of conjuration magic, we're going to build circles, and these circles are going to have divine names and names of angels and names of spirits, and maybe references to the magical names for the time that the ritual's occurring, references to different rulerships related to the spirits. And it builds kind of a nexus between the magician and the divine and the physical space in which the ritual is occurring. An alternate way of creating that environment where spirits and people can create a nexus point where they can interact is to work in a consecrated temple space where that divine presence is already linked into the space, and whatever rituals have been done to connect the person to the rites and the work that's done in that temple space connect the person in with that same sort of nexus environment of divinity, space, operant. What we do with the ancestors in Luminarium is we create an ancestor shrine that has that same sort of consecrated space to it. And it's a space that's consecrated to the dead. So it's a liminal space. It's a space that is both held by the physical person that maintains the shrine, and it's held by the spiritual persons or spirit persons who are the dead that are honored through the shrine. So the space of the shrine exists in conjunction between the spirit world and the world of the operator. So it's creating that sort of nexus point already. In addition to having that nexus, it's a nexus that is operated and empowered by your ancestors. So it's spirits that have your back. They want to see you succeed. They want to work with you. And so you have the protective element there in place by virtue of working with the ancestors. And so a lot of the things that the circle would be used for otherwise, we have the ancestors doing there. The ancestors also work as kind of a sort of leverage point. So if, say, you want to get something done in the real world, sometimes it helps to go to somebody and say, hey, I know so and I know you know so and so agrees with me that we should do this, so can you help me get this done? And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes you don't need that. Sometimes it's enough to just go to somebody and say, hey, here's this idea that's good, can you help me get this done? But people may not be as inclined to do that if they don't know who you are or if you don't have any authority to operate. But if you're referencing someone else's authority or someone else that they know or respect, that might bring them on board. Sometimes just referencing that person isn't enough. Sometimes going to the person who would support you and saying, hey, I know this isn't a thing that you do, but you know the guy who does it. Would you go put in a good word with that guy, or would you go talk to him for me? That sometimes can get things done in a much more powerful way. And so the ancestors are able to do that for you in the spirit world. They reside in that world where they're connected with other spiritual entities and are able to kind of make introductions for you. They're able to go and operate on your behalf. And in addition to that, where they can be that kind of additional leverage or additional aid in asking for something to get done, they are also there operating in the world where the spiritual agents that are performing the work for you are operating. So they can observe how the work is being done. They can step in and interject, intercede for you, and help make sure that the work is done in a way that's amenable to you. And since they are human, they understand the world, they understand our human needs in a way that other spirits may not. And so they can help guide that work. So by including them as a central element from the very beginning of the work you're doing, then that has them engaged in that work also. And so they're able to be part of that process from start to finish and help sort of manage the way that the spiritual interaction is happening.
Makes perfect sense. So I think that was another one of the big things I took away, because I had been meaning to put an ancestor altar up for a long time, and I had been talking to you about this for a while, but I didn't get around to it until I did my first conjuration for Luminarium, and just the whole process was really eye-opening, and I've had and maintained a connection with my ancestors that I just didn't have before. So I definitely encourage people to do ancestor work just because I found it pretty beneficial. The next question that I have for you, when I did my conjuration, I asked you why you assigned Michael to the day of Mercury instead of the sun. And then you did post a blog article about this, but I still thought it'd be good to talk about. So can you tell people a little bit about like why there's a difference there?
Mhm. That's something where in different sources from the medieval and Renaissance periods, they're assigned differently. Sometimes Raphael is assigned to the sun and Michael is assigned to Mercury. Sometimes Michael is assigned to the sun and Raphael is assigned to Mercury. The Golden Dawn worked this out by assigning both spirits to both spheres, but doing it on different levels of creation. So, sort of approaching, some people say that one is assigned on a Sephirotic level and one is assigned on a planetary level, which is kind of a weird Neo Golden Dawn juggling. Um, Really, one is assigned on a level that has to do with one of the worlds of creation, and the other is assigned on a different level of creation, but they're both within that sort of planetary track of forces. And so one spirit is looked at the planet operating on a certain level, the other is looked at the planet operating on another level. And that was kind of the framework in which I originally approached them and originally worked with them, was through that kind of Golden Dawn lens. And in the Golden Dawn correspondences, at the higher level, Raphael is accorded to the sun and Michael is accorded to Mercury. And so those were the primary correspondences that were sort of in my head as I began exploring conjuration and exploring the grimoires. When I saw that I had friends who did it the other way, I was curious about it and then noted that, yes, there were definitely grimoires that flipped it. But I find that when you look at some of the older and some of the more comprehensive sources, they tend to put Raphael in the sun and Michael in Mercury. So if we're going just based on the sources, I think there's a good basis for saying to go with the assignment that's used in Luminarium. I think there's other things we can look at in terms of their individual natures and the natures related to those planets, which also make a good argument for putting Raphael in the sun and Michael in Mercury. I don't see as much of an argument for reversing them based on the correspondences. Some people think of Raphael as fitting into Mercury because Mercury relates to doctors. But I give the caveat that there's a bit of a difference between healing, doctors, and medicine. And so when we're looking at the way those things play out, there's going to be different things that relate to each of those. And Mercury definitely relates more to doctors than to healing, whereas Raphael relates more specifically to divine power to heal things, which is a little bit more of a solar concept. So I don't want to go too in depth in trying to analyze all the correspondences and all the natures of it, of each spirit. As you mentioned, I have a post on my blog that's gone around that goes into that at length. And I can reshare that in the Luminarium group if people need to see it, or I can send it to you if you want to put it in your show notes.
Yeah.
But I think that's looking at the textual sources, and there's more of a basis for doing it with Raphael and the Sun and Michael and Mercury, and then looking at the actual correspondences. I think it's easier to make an argument for that. I think it can work the other way. Lots of people work with them in those other correspondences. We need to break out of the idea that angels and spirits and gods are just lines in 777 or in some other book of correspondences. They're not things in a filing cabinet. They are living dynamic beings that are vast and can encompass many, many things. And so it is definitely possible to work with them in different contexts for different purposes. So if people prefer Michael with the Sun and Raphael with Mercury, it's pretty easy to switch them out. And so basically, you just swap the names when doing the working, and that'll work out for you. So you can still use the Luminarium system the other way as far as those two angels are concerned. You just have to make sure you're swapping the names when you do so, if that's your preference.
I think what got me to notice it was the fact that I was trying to double check some of my information, and Google results actually had Michael assigned to the sun. And so I was like, wait, I'm confused. How did this happen? So just because I'm new and I don't really have those things built in yet, it was easy to get confused about that. And so it kind of took me to deciding what felt comfortable for me. But ultimately, I was able to conjure Michael on the day of Mercury. So it worked out.
Oh, maybe in 500 years, people will look at Luminarium and think that they're swapped as some sort of occult blind in order to confuse people and hide secret powers.
Yeah,
But
that's
that's not the
definitely
intention.
it. Yeah, so I guess my next question is I was curious about a couple of the items that were used in the ritual. Um, the items I'm talking about are the red cloth and the pebble with 3633 written on it. So can you like talk a little bit about the significance of those?
So those are there as part of what is being provided to the scryer if you are working in a context where there's a separate scryer from the person who's doing the actual conjuration. For most people working the book, the person doing the conjuration is also going to be the person doing the scryer, so that person has them. Uh, the red cloth, if I'm remembering correctly, is one of the items that was taken from the Hygromantia. I think in a couple other interviews, I may have said that both the cloth and the pebble were from the PGM, but I think the cloth is actually from the Hygromantia. And the pebble is from the PGM. Neither source really says why you're using them. Now, there was somebody who asked me about the pebble, and they went on and I believe found some sort of isocephia reasoning, connecting the number on the pebble to certain divine names, and suggested that might have to do with why the pebble is there. And it was some interesting stuff that they came up with, but it's stuff where it's not necessarily definitive that that's why. So my simple answer is it's there because that's what the source material says to use as a tool, and a lot of times for me that's kind of enough. But my thinking on them is that the cloth is kind of a means of containing the light and containing the spiritual power that opens the eyes to that spiritual awareness and allowing it to continue to reside in the head of the scryer instead of sort of exiting out from the head and being sort of effulgently spread out from the conjurer, from the scryer. It's a way of containing that power. I think the color red is there possibly because it helps stimulate that fire and that presence. The pebble I think of as a type of lamen, that it's there to work sort of as a phylactery or a protective object that allows the person to interact with the spirit but still create some barrier that allows them to remain safe in that case. Um, Again, both of those are speculation on my part. They are not necessarily things that were the original intended purpose, but that's why I continue to use them. I do know one person who attempted it, did not use the cloth the first time, and felt that the way in which the scrying was amplified was not as much as it could have been, and then got somewhat different results when they did use the cloth. So I think the cloth again helps sort of contain that. I think we see that in some other spiritual and magical disciplines where certain cloth coverings on the head relate to the ability of the person to be possessed or to interact with the spirit, or they relate to the containment of spiritual powers and spiritual influences and sort of the voice and contact with certain spiritual presences being contained in the head. And so that's the way that I approach and look at the cloth in this context as well. The pebble, it's very common for us to see in works of conjuration a lamen or a seal or something that is worn or held by the magician in order to help command the spirits, but also to help create some barrier of protection for the magician. And so I think the pebble works in that way in this context.
I didn't really actually know the answer to that question, and it was something that I was talking to Annalise about after the fact. And I guess both of them make sense, but for someone who hasn't used them before, it was like, I guess, a curiosity that came through on my mind. So the next question I have for you is, in one of your blog posts, you've mentioned that this could be modified to an extent. So can you give an example of like something that can be changed?
So one of the things that came up with people doing the testing for Luminarium was whether or not it was okay to use a candle instead of a lamp. I think there's a lot of points where the tools can be sort of adjusted or personalized based on your particular needs. There are some things that you really want to have there the way it is, like the grape wood, the silver coin, and the magnet in the scrying bowl. Probably want to keep those. There's probably not a lot that you want to substitute for that. Now you can use a coin that's silver colored. It doesn't have to necessarily be a physical silver coin, but there's other things where you can probably make some adjustments, and like using a candle instead of a lamp is one of them. There's some benefit to the lamp in terms of ways you can manipulate the flame of the lamp, ways you can manipulate the oil with the lamp, but you can still get the benefit that you need using a candle. Uh, as far as the ritual structure goes, the structure is intended to be sort of modular. It has parts and sections. And so if you have a section where either because of your own personal spiritual work or because of the particular spirits that you're trying to conjure, the section maybe doesn't quite fit the feel or the paradigm or pantheon that you are working in, then if you have something that does the same thing, then you might be able to swap out successfully. And I say might because there are times where people think they have a sense of what something's doing and they can make a swap in magic, and sometimes they're missing parts of it. So I don't think every swap will work the same way, but there are places where you can make swaps. And so in a recent blog post, I talked about working with nature spirits instead of working with the ancestors if you are working in an outdoor context where you might have some different tools and different setups, and maybe you're conjuring spirits that are going to be closer to the nature spirits and maybe interact in a basis that is more in line with the nature spirits. And so that's something where you could make a change. Even if you're working in an ancestor shrine and working with your ancestors and working with the angels or the aerial spirits or with the demons, then if all of the sort of Greek context stuff that is there for the way in which the ancestor service is presented in Luminarium, if that doesn't fit your religious modality and you feel that it would be an affront to your dead to try to conjure them or contact them using these Greek divinities, and you want to work in another religious context, as long as your ancestor service is doing the same thing and calling the ancestors in the same way and empowering them in the same way and building that same context for the rest of the work, then you could do that within another religious context than that Greek context that's presented. So there are ways in which you can change things out as far as the particular powers that you're using to support things. There's ways you could change things out as far as some of the tool elements. And there's ways you could change things out as far as how you're contacting particular powers. As far as the actual conjurations, say you don't like the Heptameron-based conjurations, the Hygromantia has conjurations and prayers for the day of the week also. You could use those instead. Um, if you wanted to work with conjuring demons instead of angels, you could run the ritual exactly as it is in the book, and then you just add a couple parts after the conjuration of the angel in order to conjure demon. So there's a lot of ways in which you can sort of mod it, and I think that's one of the elements that it wasn't my intention in writing the book to be like, oh, here's a system of magic to use. Here's a particular approach that can be an overall system that someone could work. The intention was just here's some rituals that you can go do. But because of the ways in which you can modify it and the ways in which you can spread it out to conjuring several different things for different purposes, you can use it for gaining knowledge, you can use it for mystical development, you can use it for practical purposes, which is what the focus in the book is. It does end up sort of working out as a whole system that someone could use, where you can mod it to work with nature spirits, you can mod it to work with fairies, you can mod it to work with demons, you can mod it to work in, instead of in a Greek context, in a Celtic context, or maybe in a Hindu context or in a Christian context. There's a lot of ways to make little changes that can make it very versatile, but where you're still using the overall structure that's presented and sort of the same hallmarks of the system of building your context based on the powers of creation and the powers that bind magic together, empowering your context through work with the ancestors or some sort of local terrestrial spirit power like nature spirits, conjuring the angels or the spirits that are going to be the sort of upper end of things that connect to the particular group of powers that you want to work with, and then conjuring whatever ultimately is going to be doing the work for you. So, and using the lamp conjuration in order to empower the scrying, that's really the central big part that makes it its own specific thing. So using that overall structure, you can rebuild that structure a lot of ways and still be working the same system. It's just going to be a matter of swapping out little components here or there.
Yeah, that makes sense. It gives me ideas too, but I haven't got that far yet. So, um, my other question for you is, um, I think I've mentioned this in a couple of my other podcasts before, but I'm not really amazing at scrying yet, and I suspect that there are other people who have the same issue. So I was really like wanting a more clear way to connect, but I didn't have it, and I don't know if there is another way, but it could also be because when I did the conjuration the first time, I had a candle and I didn't have the lamp, so I'm interested to see if I get better results down the road. But is there something that you would recommend to somebody who isn't good at scrying but wants to be able to communicate with the angel better during ritual? Is there something you could do to replace that step?
Well, I think there's sort of three ways I can answer that question. So one, as far as within the context of Luminarium system, the scrying is empowered by using your holy guardian angel or your guardian angel. There's not really a difference, to illuminate your comprehension of the spiritual forces that you're calling upon. There's sort of an idea in some systems of magic where you have a spirit that is closely connected to you and a spirit that you have kind of a more intimate contact with or an ongoing contact with. And that spirit can speak to other spirits for you, and it can let you know what those other spirits are saying. So essentially it works as like a translator or a communicator for you. It can also illuminate your occult perceptions and allow you to see more clearly and perceive more clearly. And so the angel is engaged in this ritual to do both of those things. That's what the portion from the PGM is sort of intended for. It's conjuring a god of light in order to dispel any shadows or darkness or confusion from the conjuration of the actual spirit being conjured. And so working with your holy guardian angel, creating a closer relationship with your angel can help empower the angel's ability to communicate with you and to illuminate for you. And so doing that, it's not necessarily that you have to fully improve your scrying as much as you improve that connection with the angel, and then the angel makes the communication clearer for you and sort of facilitates it for you. So that's one way you could approach it. As far as improving your ability to scry, your ability to perceive, and sort of working that out, there's a lot of different methods that could be recommended for that. Benjamin Rowe's website has a text called A Short Course in Scrying, which can be useful. Frater Akkad's crystal vision through crystal gazing can be useful for that. And the material in the Golden Dawn, I think in the Flying Rolls, but also in the Knowledge Lectures, there's material which I believe was written by Florence Farr on scrying, which is some of the best explanation of scrying that I've ever seen. And so exploring those can give some ideas. Benjamin Rowe's method works with building mental temples. And so building out the ability to perceive things in that imaginal consciousness that I talk about in Luminarium. Building mental temples and mental landscapes can be a way of improving that and engaging those senses more fully, which can help with scrying. The star sapphire from the Book of Lies, that can be useful in expanding psychic awareness and psychic sensation. Parts of Liber Batroco Phrenobomachia can be helpful for that, like the meditation on expanding out awareness from your single spot where you are through the room, through your neighborhood, through your town, through the city, through the world. That can help build that. Other elements of things in that book can be useful for that. To be very much in line with sort of neo-pagan, modern, contemporary witchcraft approaches, moon water can be useful for that. So water consecrated by the full moon's light can help awaken spiritual awareness and psychic potential. Work with Gabrielle can do that as well. So there's a lot of ways that you can engage things to improve those senses and build those up. But in the meantime, for people who need something right away before they go through a big process of building a relationship with their angel or doing all sorts of Rocky montage style training of their third eye, learn a divination system. So get some tarot cards or get some dice or a pendulum even. Any number of divination systems can be used for spirit communication. And when you approach that, you want to approach working with the spirits to communicate with you now through this divination system. Now, with what we're doing in Luminarium, you may be calling on different spirits at different times. So setting something up where you dedicate your divination tool to the angels might be difficult because you've got at least 7 different angels that you're dealing with. You might have additional angels or aerial spirits for the planets that you're dealing with. You might decide you want to modify it and work with something that's not planetary and work with an angel that doesn't fall into that planetary scheme. So you want to look at what's constant there. So you're going to consistently be working with your ancestors. You're going to be consistently working with your angels. So present your divination tool to them. Say you're using tarot cards or playing cards. Do an ancestor service, put them on your ancestor altar, maybe wrap them in some nice cloth. Ask your ancestors to speak with you through the cards. Leave them there for a few days. Go to the ancestors, talk with them a few times about that, and then do an ancestor working where you ask a question and lay out the cards and practice communicating with them through the cards. Then do the same thing with your angel. Take your lamp. If you have a name or a symbol for your angel, use that. Present the cards to the angel. Let the angel know that you're going to be working with these as a divination tool while you're trying to communicate with spirits, and you want the angel to help you with communicating with the spirits, and ask the angel to speak to you through the cards, to guide the cards, to illuminate your understanding of the cards, and repeat that a couple times. Like leave the cards with whatever you set up to honor your angel, light candles, light the lamp, do that for a few days, talk to the angel about it for a few days, and then the same thing, go through, lay out the cards, do a couple readings where you ask the angel questions and get used to communicating with the angel through the cards. And then when you are doing an actual conjuration, you can use those same cards and your ancestors, and the angel can help guide the cards for answering for the spirit for you. So you're still communicating with the spirit through your ancestors and through your angel, and you're reading what they're telling you the spirit's saying through the cards. And again, you can do this with something other than cards. If you have like a bone throwing set, you could do that. You could use runes, like I said, a pendulum. You could use a dice system where the numbers mean something. There's all sorts of ways that you could do it, but you just want to find some way that works for you. And that's something, even if you're good at scrying, that should be something in your toolkit, because sometimes it's hard to discern what is a legitimate thing you're seeing through scrying versus what is something where your mind might be interjecting something that you want to hear or want to perceive. And there's still room for interpretation with divination. It doesn't make something fully objective, but your divination system can give a more objective or more concrete level to that communication. And so you can kind of test and review what you're seeing through the scrying, or what messages you're getting through clairaudience, or through just sense perceptions of the spirits, by using divination as another layer of communication or another layer of testing. And so that's something that you probably should do even if you're good at scrying. But if you're having trouble with scrying, that's the alternative to use.
I have tarot cards and I'm pretty good at divining with tarot cards. So um, I would feel more comfortable at least in the meantime until I have like a clearer connection, I guess. Because I imagine I'm not the only person who struggles in this area, unfortunately. Um, but if I could bring my tarot deck with me and maybe experiment a little bit, it would be um, beneficial, I guess. So, yeah. Um, my next question for you is something that I actually um, had talked to Annalise about during the process, because we worked together, just like asking each other questions and making sure we understood the steps correctly. So, one of the things that we were wondering is, should the items that you use for the ritual be consecrated beforehand, or is that not as important as it seems?
I think the big thing is just kind of have items that you're using primarily for magic, that over time the ritual use will sort of consecrate the items if you're not using them for other purposes. That's an approach I've taken with several magical tools and several systems, and have found that it works well. It's just sort of the resonance of the system and the use of the item in the system can be the means of consecration. Luminarium doesn't go through any sort of real in-depth consecration process. It talks about it a little bit in one section, and basically just comes down to sprinkle the tools with some holy water and say a prayer, and that's really enough. Like when you're consecrating a tool, it depends a little bit on the tool and what the purpose is. Like if you're making like a magical artifact, say you have a dagger that is for a particular purpose, like say you're making a say you want to make a sword to incite war and incite conflict and use in magic that's for that purpose. Yeah, you could use it a bunch of times in spells and rituals for that purpose, but because it's something that's being created for a particular purpose, then maybe you would draw specific names on it, expose it to specific smokes from certain herbs, rub certain types of oils on it, and then conjure spirits that have the power related to what you want the sword to do, and put their seals onto the sword, tell them to bless and consecrate the sword, and put power into the sword to do certain things. That's not necessarily consecrating a tool for general magical use. That's like you're making a magical artifact like you would in some old story, which it's something that's a trope in fantasy stories, but it's not necessarily something that's not real. It's something that people can do, and would probably be interesting to see more people doing that. But for just your regular tools that you're using, they don't necessarily need that kind of specificity. So I know some people talk about the idea of spirits living in tools, and that's something that happens in some systems where there are particular tools that are particularly intended to house particular spirits, because of the way the tool is going to be used and the way the spirit's going to be engaged. But that's not necessarily the case for most of the tools that you're working with. Most of the tools you're working with, they just need to be sacred in the sense that they are separated out and set for a particular purpose. That's basically what consecration is you are cleaning something from other purposes and setting it apart from other purposes so that its use is focused on this one thing, and that any power it gets from contact with that one thing remains focused on that one thing and isn't diffused throughout all sorts of other purposes. So that's really all you need to do. Sprinkling some holy water will clean the tool and will give it some level of empowerment. If you really want to add that sort of spiritual power or charism to the tool, sprinkle it with holy water and then anoint the tool with anointing oil. And probably a general anointing oil like chrism or balsam. And then, or just plain olive oil that's been prayed over. And then that's it. That's what you're gonna do for empowering your tool. You could run it through some incense, but again, you want something general like abramelin incense or frankincense if you're doing that. Do what's comfortable for you. Do what makes you feel good about the use of the tool. But I would say saying a prayer or reading a psalm, sprinkling some holy water, that's really all you need. If you want to juice the tool up, add some anointing oil, sense it with some incense, and that might give you a nice, cool tool that's been empowered to start off with, and that might be beneficial. But if you just clean the tool and pray over it and then use it routinely in ritual, that's going to empower the tool too, and that'll probably be fine for what we're doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. The reason I ask is because I actually started to consecrate all my tools beforehand and then realized that it wasn't particularly mentioned. And I was like, is this even important? It was like a second nature for me at that point. So I was like, well, I figure maybe I'm not the only person who just automatically does this. So the next set of questions I have are mostly from Annalise. So she wants to know what process you took to determine like each of the steps that would work for the ritual. Like, how did you put the whole system together and syncretize it?
Okay, so, well, again, I used a framework that I had used previously for this, but in putting that sort of thing together, my general approach is sort of a combination of things. So there's part of it that's logical and analytical. I've studied a lot of different magic over the years and have read a lot of different magical works, and I've been reading and looking at grimoires since I was probably about 14 or 15, and have been trying to understand the different concepts and the different parts and why they work the way they do since that point. And so some of my approach will be looking at different sources and being like, oh, okay, this seems like it does this. And this is what I need overall to be done in this ritual context. So I could use this piece to do that. And I like this piece. I like the way this feels. It seems like it would be effective. So some of it is that kind of logical approach. There's some that is sort of inspirational. Like maybe I see something while reading a book and it's like a light turns on and is like, hey, this is important. Save this, use this, find where this fits in what you want to do. And so that can be the sort of the reason for using something sometimes. Other times it can have much more to do with the spirits. So as you're trying to figure out a mode of working and what would be an effective mode of working, sometimes the spirits will tell you, do this, do that. This is what we want. This is what's going to be effective. Sometimes they will sort of inspire for you to look at a particular source and then sort of show you, yes, that's the thing that you need to be doing. I had one time, not with Luminarium, but with the Dionysian mystery tradition that I've been sort of working with for years now. when I was originally putting together the first major ritual of that system, I was laying in bed getting ready to go to sleep and was sort of like, okay, how is this going to work? And all of a sudden I had this sense as if like Dionysus was telling me, this is what I want to have happen in this ritual. This is how this ritual should play out. So sometimes there's direct spirit interjection telling you how to put things together. Sort of the flip side of that communication is sometimes I might have an idea where I think, hey, this would work. This would be a way that this could fit together. And then I might take it to the spirit that would be facilitating that work and say, hey, would you do this thing if this is the ritual that I do, or if this is the ritual that someone does? Like, is this a possible way to work with you to do this? And if the spirit's like, yes, that works, I would respond to that, then I go with it. If it's something where the spirit's like, no, that's ridiculous, then I go back to the drawing board. Or maybe it's something where they say like, yeah, that would work, but it'd be better if you tweak this or change this or add this piece in. So there's different ways in which I kind of come to those pieces, and usually it's a combination of them where it'll start off with kind of the intellectual analytic approach, some of the inspiration and the seeing the beauty of certain things will kind of come in there and help shape how that analytical approach is. And then sometimes there'll be things where it's shaped by working with the spirits. Sometimes it's shaped by the spirits saying specifically what they want or don't want. And then other times it's me going and asking them for their input and review and advice on what I'm putting together.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like a multi-step process that you take, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the next question that she has is, what is the process, or excuse me, let's see, I'm gonna start that over and cut this out. Okay, so the next question that she has is, have you ever had an experience during ritual where you realized that you could have done something differently, and what was the reasoning behind it?
I'm sure that has happened. There's not a ton that stand out to me as far as anything recently. I know it's come up sometimes in group rituals where it'll be like the first time rolling out a group ritual and something will seem really good when it's scripted out. And then you do it and it's like, whoa, this is a lot of weird downtime. Or, oh, this is really awkward to actually try and like roll this out or explain it to people or do this way, or the pacing on this is just really wrong, or this is not creating the sense that it's supposed to create. So there's things where the environmental factors of actually executing it might get in the way of the spiritual engagement. And that can be something where when you go through and try it out, it becomes really evident. And and that's something, if you've worked in any sort of lodge context, you'll see that, because there's definitely things where like Crowley wrote rituals that he didn't do. And so there's points where there's extra stage directions that don't work when you actually plot them out, or things where a stage direction just doesn't make sense for the flow or just isn't entirely possible the way that it's written. And so as people do it, they come up with ways to make it work. Now, I think in a more magical context, what can sometimes happen is we're doing things and we get inspiration from the spirits we're working with, or we get directly told by the spirits we're working with that what we're doing is not the way to do it, or maybe what we're doing is fine, but we need to do something else in addition to that. Excuse me. Like I had, for instance, once where I was making some necromantic offerings out at a boundary point, and while I was doing it, there was this, or as I was beginning and doing like the initial prayers before I began making the offerings, I heard this voice in my head. It was like, you can't proceed unless you pay Charon. You have to make payment to Charon in order to do this. And immediately it felt obvious that well, yeah, if I'm doing this necromantic work, I need to pay the ferryman to carry the things over and bring back what I need. And I reached in my pocket and had exactly 2 matching coins in my pocket. There was like no other coins there. Generally, I wasn't using cash at the time, so it was unusual for me to have coins in my pocket. And so I was like, okay, well, definitely, yes, this is something I should do. And so I threw the coins across the boundary line out to where I was going to lay the offerings. In working with the Olympic spirits, there were things where I thought they would make sense to do, and spirits were like, no, don't do that. That's silly. Why would you do that? And so sometimes you're going to get that where the spirits tell you, like, no, you don't need to do this, or yes, you do need to do this. Sometimes there's going to be things where you go to make an offering or go to do things, and spirits might be offended by it. Once I decided that I sort of wanted to do an ancestor meal, but I was kind of going pretty low key with it and didn't prepare as much as I probably should have, and uh, went to provide food from my own plate onto their plate, and I got this like immediate, "What are you doing?" Like, no, no, we don't want your scraps. You need to actually prepare something for us. And so there's moments like that where you'll get influence from the spirits or messages from the spirits that tell you like what you're doing is wrong or what you're doing is right, but you need to add more to what you're doing that's right. And then there's also going to be moments where it's just your experience as a person where you're like, whoa, this is not working. Let me change this thing about it. And sometimes the not working will be a mechanical element where you realize that what you're doing is not affecting things the way that you want to affect them. Sometimes it will be an experiential element where you're creating an environment that's not conducive to experiencing what you're trying to experience. And so, yeah, I think that's a pretty routine thing that happens when you're doing magical work regularly over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So basically, it's okay to like take your intuition if something feels like it would be better replaced or done differently, follow that because it may be something that's valid.
Yeah, and that's something I've been excited about with getting to see feedback of people trying Luminarium is when somebody gets inspiration of like, well, hey, maybe I should make this change, or maybe I should experiment with this thing, or try this or that, and then they do it and come back and post about it in the Luminarium group or message me about it. That's kind of neat to see and can help inform my own work as well, as far as it's something that I didn't think about or hadn't like experimented with previously. But then I get to hear about other people experimenting with it and how it's working for them, particularly if you end up having a few people try the same sorts of things and seeing multiple people trying those experiences. I think that'll be a neat thing to unfold and watch with this.
Yeah, I agree. I hope people definitely, when they buy the book, go join the group as well, because I think that the more that I do this, I'll be posting in the group. So it'll be cool to kind of just see, because I've already seen a couple people post in there and go through their experiences. So it's been a lot of learning for even me, just as someone that's just chilling in the group. So yeah, I'm all for that. So the next question that she has is, have you ever noticed like a different like feeling after conjuring one spirit over another? Like, do you feel different the day after, or can you sense them differently? Is it like noticeable?
Yeah, no, there's definitely things where depending on the spirit, they will have a different sort of presence and a different feeling. I've also found that depending on the method used for conjuration, that can create different presences and different feelings. And I know some people don't have that experience of like using one method versus another changes things. But to me, there's some methods that are more inclined for creating communication, whereas there's other methods that are more inclined for being used to get something done. And the way in which the interaction with the spirit feels is different between those sorts of methods. There's also things where, depending on the context that you're calling the spirit in, like if there's different sorts of spiritual forces that are being called upon in order to set up the way that the space is working and the way that the space allows you to interact with the spirit, just mechanically, that's going to define that there has to be some difference in the experience and some difference in the way in which you and the spirit communicate. And so that's going to create different feelings as well. But then the nature of the spirit you're working with versus the nature of another spirit that you work with that will also change sort of the feeling and the effect. And sometimes, yeah, that can have feelings or effects that last beyond just the interaction. Sometimes because they explain something or teach something, or they kind of touch or empower you in a given way, that can have a lasting impact. Sometimes just by being in the space of a particular presence, that can have some sort of impact that can have sort of an aura around the actual time of the conjuration, where you're still experiencing some of the effects of that presence and influence beyond that. So yeah, no, that's very reasonable. That should be a thing that's happening.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess this leads into the next couple of questions. So if you're finding yourself drained after doing like a particular ritual, what does it mean? And is there something that you would recommend to recover quickly in between doing rituals so you can do it again, basically sooner than later?
So I had a conjuration once years ago. This was the first public conjuration that I did, and was still pretty early in me doing conjurations using a grimoire method, and I was using the Mathers version of the Key of Solomon at that point, and did all the stuff. Used a white clerical robe, drew the full circle on the floor with salt, prayed all the psalms while the circle was being done, did all kinds of stuff to prepare the tools and everything, and worked in a maybe not fully complete context, but a fairly complete context. And I didn't use proper incense. I used like incense sticks, and so I didn't go through consecrating the incense and consecrating the flames and coals and container, and it wasn't like a nice incense. It was just your stick incense that you pick up at your cult shop. And just because that was what I was used to using at the time. And so, I mean, we had the incense burners at each of the 4 points around the circle, like it says to in the book. I think we had one up at the altar. We had another altar outside of the circle that had the seal for the spirit and had more incense there. And so we had a lot of it. But um, after the ritual, I felt like my insides had all been ripped out. Like just all the life, all the energy had been drained out of me. And I went to, there used to be a coffee shop in the area that was owned by some witches, and they would do like these pagan nights once a month where a band would come in and pagan groups would come in and network. And so the OTO group, we would go to this. And so we had done the conjuration, and then we went to the coffee house. It's actually, I don't know if you hear the siren in the background going by, but that's kind of funny while telling the story, because we conjured Raphael for healing in that instance. And on my way home from the coffee house that day, I saw 6 ambulances, but not like on the road. It was like different places where ambulances were stopped at, like homes or businesses, helping people. Which usually, like, you pass an ambulance, it's not like they're actively doing something, it's like driving somewhere. But this was like 6 of them, which is the number of the sun, uh, all like actively like touching places where people were. And so that was like a weird thing to have happen after that conjuration. And so like telling the story of it and then having a siren go off in the background is amusing to me.
Yeah,
Um,
that's like very synchronistic.
yeah. So I I felt awful when we got to the coffee shop and just sort of like laid my head out on a table and couldn't pull myself together. And people who were with me were like, "Well, you seemed so powerful and so in command during that conjuration, and there was just clearly so much energy channeling through you and in the space." That they were like, it's not surprising that you feel sort of wiped out now. And but that wiped out feeling lasted for a couple days. And um and I didn't really know what was going on, so I went to my mentor and asked him, and he said that part of it was probably that I didn't use good enough incense, that the incense being part of the offering that was given to the spirit in order to help the spirit come into the space and be present, and sort of part of what was building that in between nature of the space and giving the spirit something to pull together for its manifestation and its communication. That by kind of cheaping out on the incense, I was sort of cheaping out on the material that the spirit had to work with, the power that the spirit had to work with, the gift that was being given to the spirit. And so it needed to then draw off of the energy that I was putting forth into the ritual otherwise. I don't know in hindsight how much I necessarily agree with that interpretation, but I've always made sure to use better incense since then and have not run into that problem. Another thing at the time, being a rambunctious, like 23, 24-year-old, I was like, who needs a lawman? Like, you don't need a lawman. You can just go out there and do stuff. Like, you don't need protection. Like, why are you going to wear protection to chill with an angel? And so I wasn't wearing a lawman. And that was another thing that he said was probably a problem, was I didn't create enough of a barrier between the spirit and myself, and I didn't create like a sign of the authority to work with the spirit by not wearing the lawman. And so I had to try to compensate for that by fully creating that authority and that presence by the power that I was putting forth into the space. And so those were kind of the interpretations he had, and they were interpretations that did affect how I practiced after that. And I haven't run into that same problem since I made those changes. But I think there are definitely times where we do bigger magical stuff, and sometimes it can be draining. It can take a toll on us. I think a lot of times with doing magic that engages spirits, that's not going to be as big of a thing or as common of a thing. But different people respond to things in different ways. So there might be something about just building that space, working with that space, putting yourself in the mindset to experience and perceive those spiritual powers and realities, where maybe that will have that impact for certain people, regardless of the things that they do. I think as far as recovering from that, sleep, eating foods that like energize you and make you feel healthy and good, um, things like that are going to be good things to recover. Um, Sorry, I forgot there's a daily alarm there. Let me turn that off real quick. But those sorts of like normal recovery activities are the same recovery activities you would want to have there, like meditation, prayer. Those can be good things to add in. Ritual bathing can be a good thing to add in. Things that are going to kind of bring you back to a normal state and bring you back to kind of a state of empowered healthiness, are kind of what you want there.
Yeah, all of those things make sense. Um, the incense story is kind of funny though, because I've had that experience myself. Not uh not quite like to that extent, but it's funny that it came up because I definitely noticed that my spirits prefer a higher quality incense, and I had purchased like an excess of some of the cheaper stuff, and I'm trying to get rid of it as fast as I can. So that makes a lot of sense. But also touching the bases of, normal, take care of yourself makes sense too.
Mhm.
So the last question I have is a question from me, and um, I don't know where this question came from, but I guess, is there like a limit to how often you can do a conjuration other than, just taking care of yourself?
I don't I don't really think so. I think sometimes like trying to conjure every day can get to be a lot, but like every other day can be pretty comfortable, um, at least in my experience. But there might be sometimes where you have needs where doing a conjuration every day is going to be what you have to do, and that's navigable. You can do it. Sometimes doing more than one conjuration a day might be needed and can be navigable, and you can do it. I don't think there's any real limitation outside of your schedule and the amount of time that it takes to do the conjuration, and just your sort of wherewithal to be able to get through it as often as you need to. I don't think there's a ton of point to doing a bunch of conjurations a day on a regular basis. Like, there's definitely a point to having engagement in spiritual practices and working with spirits on a daily basis, and maybe doing things that relate to that more than once in a day. But I don't think generally it you necessarily need to conjure at every planetary hour of the day, at least not like a full conjuration. Um, I think that would be something that would get kind of difficult for people over time to do that. Or maybe you do it and it flexes the muscles enough that it gets to be comfortable and normal for you. I haven't really known a lot of people who've done it with that kind of frequency. There was a guy that I knew a little bit. He was a former student of my mentor, and he decided he was going to conjure all 72 demons of the Goetia Solomon in one weekend. And he was doing drugs and conjuring demons at the same time. And my understanding is basically that he would like go through the conjuration, conjure one of them, not really do anything with it, not really ask it much of anything, just kind of go through confirming it was there, and then just be like, all right, you go chill over in the corner. I'm going to conjure the next one now. And it was just this sort of like ongoing process, which it takes about an hour or so to do that, maybe more. So it was probably basically an around the clock process for him to try to do all 72 in one weekend. And he kind of stopped being my mentor student after that, because my mentor was just like, when he read the journal entries for it, you could just feel like the bad feeling of it just sort of oozing off of the pages. It was not a good idea. It wasn't something that was healthy or a useful thing for anyone. So I think there are points of overdoing it, but that's a really extreme story. And so maybe the point of overdoing it is a point where you're hitting a really intense extreme, or a point where you're just doing something that you can't necessarily handle. Maybe somebody who's in a balanced and stable position could run through that, probably not 72 in a 2 to 3 day period, but maybe 4 or 5 in a day or something like that, and doing that every day. Again, I don't see a ton of reason to do it that way. Not, at least not individual conjurations. I guess if you're doing something where you're conjuring more than one spirit at once, like in the Avermelon, that's different. But going through and doing like a full conjuration ritual for an individual spirit a whole bunch of times in a day, I don't see a lot of reason for that. But there could be a reason, and it could be doable. But I don't think it should be the norm for most people.
Yeah, I think for me, it was coming from the polar opposite of too much. It was more like I couldn't think of it a reason good enough to do it, but sometimes I just wanted that experience. So like giving myself permission to want to do that more was, I guess, where it comes from, versus like wanting to do all 72 in a weekend.
Yes.
So yeah. Um
And I think if you're in a place where you want to have that experience, do it, because there's so often where things get in the way and where stuff leads us to a point where we make excuses not to. But if you're like, man, I really want to conjure a spirit today, and you've got the time and you've got the energy and you can put the stuff together, do it. Like, don't worry about if it's frivolous or pointless. I mean, sure, there's the Sorcerer's Apprentice story where the guy, Agrippa's student, conjures a demon without realizing he's conjuring the demon, and the demon shows up and is like, dude, why'd you call me? And the guy's just like petrified. And the demon's like, dude, this is not cool. Why'd you call me? And the guy's still petrified. And the demon's like, all right, whatever, and rips the guy's heart out.
oh my god.
So, like, when you call them, have a reason, but that reason could just be to talk to them, to learn things, to get the experience. Um, they're probably not going to rip your heart out for being frivolous. Like that's just a scary story. But there's still a lesson to the story. Like you should have some purpose. Like don't just call them to be like I want to look at an angel, but call them and like ask about things in your life. Call them, ask about things that they teach. If you want the experience, have the experience. Just make the experience mean something for yourself, and it doesn't have to be some life altering huge need that you're calling them for. Sometimes it's better to call them when you're just trying to get to know them and get to know what's going on, because then you're going to be more readily able to contact them when you do have a need, but also they might teach you things, show you things, guide you in ways that might prevent the need for even calling them for some need in the future, because you're already balancing and improving things in your life based on that contact.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and gives me a lot more inspiration to go do that more often. So, yeah, this has been wonderful. I love your answers to all of these questions. So,
Thank you.
I don't have any more, but it's been great to talk to you today, and thanks for giving me the time.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate you bringing me on.